Ramaphosa needed this coalition to remain president. The impeachment committee is being established. The impeachment process is going to run, and he's going to be subjected to the most horrendous interrogation on difficult issues which I believe he's got no answers for. To go on a whole expedition of illegal activities, including crossing borders into Namibia, abducting people, abducting a woman who was a domestic worker at the Phala Phala farm, torturing them. Ramaphosa stands guilty of very, very serious crimes.
Welcome back to Palatable Politics, a show where we make politics palatable. With me, your host, TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show. Today, we're going to be joined by Mr. Carl Niehaus, who's a veteran. I mean, he contributed in the struggle, was in prison. He former ANC spokesperson, he's been an ambassador, is was an ANC MP, and then was currently an EFF MP. Mr. Carl Niehaus, welcome to the show.
Thank you, TJ, and thanks for having invited me. Yes, you're quite admissible for you to confuse it. I've been for almost 45 years a member of the ANC, so it was part of how I was known. So, yeah, but now, of course, I'm a member of the Economic Freedom Fighters.
With that said, why the change? Why did you go from ANC after 45 years to EFF?
There's a long answer to it, and I'll give you the medium length answer because we have a lot to speak about.
Yes.
I left the ANC because I was deeply disappointed with many of the policy positions that the ANC had taken since 1994. In fact, reality is I should have been disappointed even before 1994 because some of the negotiated positions that the ANC took in terms of the CODESA negotiations and the constitutional negotiations were unpalatable compromises. But at that stage, I believed that we were building a bridgehead, that yes, we are making compromises, but as time goes on and we have the majority, we will then be able to change some of those compromises and address the real economic transformatory issues that we need to address. Unfortunately, we didn't. Unfortunately, instead of doing those radical economic transformation changes, we became more and more neoliberal. And one of the worst betrayals of that period was the time of Thabo Mbeki. Because Thabo had a 2/3 majority. He could have made some of the decisions that could have turned around some of the compromises that were made during the elections and negotiations for 1994. But he didn't. Now, let me, before you ask me the next question, say, under those circumstances, I became more and more unhappy with what was happening inside the ANC. But I was a loyal member of the ANC. I joined the ANC when I was 19 years old. I always said the ANC is my family. So just to simply take your jacket and leave, so to speak, was not for me an option. So I kept on complaining and criticizing and disagreeing inside the organization, believing that if I do it persistently enough together with fellow comrades, we will be able to bring about the change that we hope for. I failed. And eventually, by 2022, 2023, it was clear to me. The ANC that I knew, the ANC that I committed to, the ANC that I joined in 1979 is gone. It's no longer the organization I knew, and certainly no longer the organization that I wanted to be part of. And the ANC also, of course, turned on me. They fought me viciously. They fired me from my job as a senior manager in the office of the Secretary General of the ANC.
That was Ace Magashule
during the time of Ace Magashule. They then charged me with disciplinary charges because I said that the judiciary in South Africa is captured. So by the time I left, I had already a expulsion hanging over my head, which I appealed, But finally, after the 2023 National Conference of the ANC, when Ramaphosa was re-elected, I said, there's no place for me in this organization any longer. I then decided to drop my appeal against that expulsion, and I wrote a letter of resignation. And it was very painful for me, I must tell you. I was literally physically ill for over a week after I sent that final letter of resignation. Because when you've been with an organization as long as I've been, when you sacrificed as much as I did, when you went to prison for many years for being a member of the ANC, it's not a simple thing to leave.
Yeah, I'd imagine. You touched on CODESA, and I'm going to use that as a base to come to a snapshot of our current political system. But in those negotiations, the compromises that were made in the negotiations, were those us downplaying the compromises with the intention that we'll change it later, or was it a selling out?
The way I look at it now is that it was a selling out. But it was not necessarily seen like that by all of us, including myself. I thought, well, yes, these are unpalatable compromises, the Section 25 provisions in the Constitution on the guarantee of property rights, the sunset clauses, the way in which we negotiated the right to cultural self-determination for many of the primarily white Afrikaner groups, because that's them who asked for it mainly, that all of those issues were selling out. But I was hoping that, yes, we made these compromises, but as the new democracy develops, and as the ANC gets more and more into its own as the government, and understands also how power works and understands how to use power, that we would be able to then change those compromises and address the real issues of the return of the land to the people, expropriation of land without compensation, which is implicitly provided for in the Freedom Charter. But we never got there. We never did those things. Instead, as I said, we became more and more neoliberal. We allowed the Section 25 part of the Constitution to remain. We continue to protect property rights. We have now a new liberal economic approach. The budgets that we get year after year are infused by new liberalism. We allow ourselves to be dictated to by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. We do not do fundamental change of the economy. In fact, we undermine the instruments for economic growth and economic empowerment that existed and that we inherited from the old apartheid regime, although those instruments were racially defined in the apartheid regime. And that is the state-owned enterprises, Eskom, South African Railways, ISCO, which we sold off. So we're allowed to lose those critical instruments for black empowerment and for the upliftment of the majority of black poor. And we never seem to understand what the old apartheid regime did with those state-owned enterprises in terms of selectively, yes, only for the white and mainly for the Afrikaner poor, but they used those state-owned enterprises to uplift the white poor people, white working class, into lower middle class and middle class. I myself understand that very well because my own family came out of Afrikaner working class stock. My dad was a worker on the South African Railways. He worked as a fitter and turner. And I understand how I benefited as a young white South African from the South African Railways. Because we got a house. My dad had a job with medical aid. I got sponsorships from various institutions South African railways and also the Afrikaans cultural associations, one that was known as the ATKV to get bursaries to go to university. These were all done by government, state-owned enterprises which formed the foundation. But we allowed it to be eroded away. We allowed the black working class to plunge into deeper and deeper poverty. And we allowed now a very large part of the African community to be in a situation of permanent unemployment and a situation where they feel that there's no light at the end of the tunnel. People, young students who go and study, even when they do manage to get their qualifications, they can't get jobs. All of this could have been different if we changed our attitude in terms of the transformation of the economy and if we understood the importance that government has to play in taking decisive interventions to transform the economy. And if we empowered our state-owned enterprises, but instead of empowering them, we eroded them. We started selling off bits and pieces of them. We went on to a privatization model rather than a state empowerment model. And all of this, I believe, was a betrayal of what the original struggle in South Africa was all about, which was not just about having the vote. Certainly not. It was about economic information and empowerment given to the people of this country. I always remember those very seminal Radio Freedom interviews that the longest-serving president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, used to give. And I used to listen to them surreptitiously. And I remember he always talked about economic empowerment is a critical part of liberation. He always said the racism that we have in South Africa dovetails. And I remember one interview that was also, I saw it somewhere on television years later, and he used to put his fingers like this. He said, it dovetails between racism and economic exploitation. And if we don't understand that overlap, and if we don't address both those issues, we will betray the revolution. And sadly, that is what we did. We betrayed the revolution because we never paid attention or allowed the economic transformation required in order to address the way in which racism was used by the old apartheid racist regime, also as a tool of economic exclusion and to impoverish the majority of black South Africans.
With that said, there's a corner of society that says life was better under apartheid. What's your take on that?
I hate that phrase because I don't think it understands the circumstances where we came out of apartheid. Apartheid was a vicious system. Apartheid destroyed the lives of people and took the most basic civil liberties away from people. We have some of those civil liberties today, but sadly, we haven't been able to give form and shape to them in terms of economic empowerment. So we failed to give the potential of what the liberation or so-called liberation in South Africa could have been to the people of the country. But you cannot compare the current government and the situation in South Africa with the apartheid regime. Yes, we must acknowledge that we failed. We must acknowledge that poverty is pervasive in South Africa, that we have the most unequal society in the world, and none of these things are anything to be proud of. But it is certainly not comparable with the old racist apartheid regime. And it usually comes either from people who are not thinking clearly, politically, from frustration, or on the other hand, it comes from racists. White, so-called Afrikaner Boere racists who hanker back to the old apartheid system and will tell you that everything was better under apartheid. We had better local government administration. We had better infrastructure. We had better. For who? For that small percentage of whites? Was that true for the majority of black and especially African South Africans? Certainly not. So when we use a phrase like that, it is deeply ideologically loaded in the wrong way. And it has strong racist undertones, which we should reject with the contempt that it deserves.
Now, coming to SA and what's happening now, if someone woke up from or came out of a cave somewhere and they had asked you, what's the political situation in SA, what would you say?
I will say we are a society that have failed our people. We are a society in crisis because we've not managed to bring economic transformation and the empowerment of the majority of South Africans. We are a society that is still deeply divided along racist lines. And that sadly enough, many of what was erected by the illegitimate apartheid system has remained in place in terms of spatial development, in terms of the economic distribution of power, what you see on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, what you see in terms of land ownership, where whites are still the major owners of land and of shares in South Africa. And I'll say the previous racist oppressors of South Africa mainly, I'm not saying totally so, but mainly have remained unrehabilitated and continues to be racist and continue to hanker back to the old apartheid racist system. And I'll say we need to change that, but we're not going to change it with this current government of national unity led by the largest party still in parliament, the African National Congress, and that sadly the man who's today the president of South Africa is a sellout, has sold us out many, many years ago, even during the negotiations, and today is responsible for undermining the Constitution of South Africa, ironically the Constitution which he was part of writing, and is also responsible for undermining the rule of law and refuses to be accountable to the people of South Africa, and has abused the majority of the ANC in the National Assembly, in Parliament, in order to cover up for his criminal activities.
We're going to come into Phala Phala.
Yeah.
But before that, you mentioned the aspect of the GNU. And the first GNU we had in 94. You were part of the team that negotiated it. What's the difference between the two? Why was it okay then? And why is there the view that you hold on it now?
Look, it's day and night. The government of national unity that was formed in terms of agreements that were made before 1994, 27th of April, and then implemented after the elections of the 27th of April 1994, was based on the premise that we want to build a government as broad as possible, representative of various political parties. Inclusive. That government was born out of the need for us to do nation building, and in order to establish that foundation. So it was truly a government of national unity. The government of so-called national unity that we see today was not on the basis of that commitment that Nelson Mandela had of the ANC of 1994 to build this inclusive nation. Remember, he was under no obligation to form a government of national unity in terms of the outcome of the vote.
Because he had a clean majority.
The ANC had a clean majority. Now it is simply because of necessity the ANC, because of its persistent failures and disappointment that a large part of the South African people and voters suffered with the ANC, lost its overall majority. So it needed to form a coalition government. It is not a government of national unity. It is not building a united consensus amongst all the people of South Africa. It is not an exercise in nation building. It is simply a narrow coalition in order to get the right numbers so that the ANC, and especially the elite in the ANC, could continue to remain in power. So Ramaphosa needed this coalition to remain president. Gwede Mantashe, with his big fat stomach, needed this coalition in order to remain the Minister for Mineral and Energy Affairs. And so I can go on and on. And sadly, it was not built on the basis of ideology. It was built on the basis of expediency. Because there was a potential model of creating a left-leaning coalition government. The figures count up. If the ANC, MK Party, the EFF, and some of the other smaller on the left parties, ATM and others, were able to come together, there would have been a majority. So it was a deliberate decision not to go for a left, more progressive coalition, but to go again for a new liberal model, one which the big capitalists in South Africa, white monopoly capitalism, and the big capitalist organizations internationally, the imperialists, wanted. So Ramaphosa listened to his masters. He listened to those he is beholden to. And therefore, he went for a coalition with the Democratic Alliance and with some of the other reactionary parties that now form part of this so-called government of national unity. This does not emphasize unity. It emphasizes a deep, fundamental ideological split in the South African body politic. With, on the one hand, the more progressive parties and the strongest exponent of those progressive parties, the one that is ideologically the clearest, the economic freedom fighters. On the other hand, a group of sellouts who are implementing neoliberal economic policy programs, who compromise every single thing that the former liberation movement, the African National Congress, stood for in a government of national unity. So this is not unity, it is fundamental division. It widens the crack between those who are on the left and those who are on the reactionary right side of politics. And that is, unfortunately, the consequence of what Ramaphosa now euphemistically, because he tries in a sleight of hand to present to us as if he's the head of a government of national unity. It's utter poppycock. He's simply the president of a right-wing, compromised coalition government that represents new liberal interests, the interests of white monopoly capital and imperialism, who's in control of him. Because over the years, he's made deals with them, sell his soul to the white monopoly capitalist devil. He did so during the negotiations. He entrenched that process of selling his soul in the run-up to the 2017 elections for the ANC presidency, the ANC National Conference that was held in December 2017, where R1 billion was spent to bribe delegates and those with influence in the ANC to get Ramaphosa to become the president. That R1 billion came from big capital in South Africa, from Investec, from the Stellenbosch Mafia, and so forth. These people invested in Cyril Ramaphosa to become the president because they know that he was going to do their bidding. And that is also exactly the reason why Ramaphosa is finding it so hard to get out of government even when he feels uncomfortable. Because you know that in 2022, when the Phala Phala government, Phala Phala scandal broke, and Arthur Fraser had taken those very serious charges to the Rosebank police station.
You were with him, hey?
I was there when he went to do so. Now, what happened? Ramaphosa said, I would like to resign. Guedemantash and a few others, Monli Gungubelo, they said no, because obviously it wasn't fitting their interest. They were going to fall under the bus together with Ramaphosa. But more importantly, it was the white monopoly capital who invested in him, who called the IOUs back, said, you can't leave. We have invested in you billions. You will stay and you will carry out the job that you have to do for us, who have been the investors in you. And it's now again the same. I think it would have been the only reasonable, rational thing for Cyril to do after the judgment of the Constitutional Court that said it was an unconstitutional act to have had that vote in Parliament and to have prevented the establishment of the Impeachment Committee in terms of the decision of the Section 89 independent panel. No, Ramaphosa now says he's going to take it on review. He is subjecting himself to the most horrendous process of investigation, both in that review process, but the real sting in the whole thing is going to be in that impeachment committee. And remember, yes, he can take the matter on review. The impeachment committee is being established. The impeachment process is going to run, even during the time that this review of his is going on. And he is going to be subjected to the most horrendous interrogation on difficult issues which I believe he's got no answers for, which is evident that he's committed major crimes. He contravened the South African Revenue Services regulations. He should have declared the money that he had, which has never been declared. We don't know where it came from. Perhaps it came from buffaloes. Perhaps it came from somewhere else. There's lots of speculation where this money come from. Some people say, well, the man confused himself. He thought bank means coach rather than putting it in a real bank. But anyhow, just as that's as an officious aside. But the reality is he's going to go through a very horrendous period of interrogation and cross-examination. He is forced to face it because he cannot resign, because his handlers are forcing him to stay at all, and in this instance, at every cost. I don't feel sorry for him. He must grill in his own fires. He collected the coals, he lit the fire, now he must burn.
I'm going to go into Phala Phala properly next, but it's just one thing I want to clarify or find out. The Progressive Caucus, EFF or so, would have preferred the GNU to, as you said, be more left with ANC, MK, EFF, etc., right? If that had happened, who would EFF or the Progressive Caucus wanted to be the president?
I don't think we can speculate about that. I think that's a moot question, really, because we don't and we can't foresee the dynamics that would have informed that process. For me, the important part of the discussion is not about who we would have wanted to be the president. because it may very well not have been Cyril Ramaphosa.
Which is what ANC is saying.
Well,
Why they couldn't
again,
do
here we
EFF.
speculate. But
Okay.
it is, of course, a major problem when you want to make someone the president who has this dark cloud of Phala Phala hanging over his head, which compromises our constitution, which compromises the rule of law, which undermines the various pillars of what makes up the state in South Africa, breaks down those pillars, it erodes the separation of powers. There's so much that there is to be worried about if you bring someone with that history and that baggage that Ramaphosa has into the position as head of state. So we may very well not have wanted Ramaphosa. But I don't think that is the issue to discuss, because I think the ANC wants us to discuss it in those terms, rather than in clear ideological terms. Because the ANC doesn't want to acknowledge that it made a clear ideological decision for a right-wing sellout government of national unity, or so-called government of national unity, really just a right-wing sellout coalition, rather than a progressive left coalition, which would have included the economic freedom fighters, with all the strong ideological positions and economic freedom in our lifetime commitment that the EFF can bring to such a coalition.
Now, officially on Phala Phala, there's a lot of speculation, as you said, as to where the money's from. Where do you think it's from?
You know, we can speculate. But obviously the money must have come from the same nefarious powers that have been supporting Ramaphosa in all the wrongdoing that he has done. And I'm pretty sure that it was part of the whole process of buying him over, of getting money also for bribing people, for influencing electoral processes, all of that. But perhaps it will come out during the impeachment hearings where the money came from. It will be very interesting. But let's deal with the facts. As I sit here, I'm not exactly sure where the money came from. But I do know that it was undeclared money. I do know that it was a huge amount of money. I do know that when that money was stolen from the couch, that Ramaphosa clearly was in a pickle, that he did not want the authorities to know about this money, that he had never declared this money to the South African Reserve Bank, nor did he declare anything with the South African Revenue Service, that all of this was illegal. I know that he wanted his money back, and therefore he illegally instructed the head of his Presidential Protection Unit, Major General Wally Rode, to go on a whole expedition of illegal activities, including crossing borders into Namibia, abducting people, abducting a woman who was a domestic worker at the Phala Phala farm, torturing them in order to try and get the information where the money was. Now, these are the facts.
Do we know if they actually got the money back? Or once they tortured these guys?
I really don't know,
Okay,
because as
side
far
chat.
as I can remember, there were stories about the people who allegedly stole the money went on buying sprees, and a lot of the money was spent on luxuries and all kinds of things. But you see, none of these things are really relevant at this stage.
Okay. Yes, true.
The facts are the ones that I've just shared with you. And on those facts, rather than all the padding and the gossip around it, Ramaphosa stands guilty of very, very serious crimes. And that is why the independent panel, the Section 89 panel under Mr. Justice Ngobo, said this man has got a serious prima facie case to answer. And, you know, we have a very short memory span in South Africa. We don't always remember the hard facts of the historical events that has happened. We should go back to that Section 89 panel report and go and look at the findings of the independent panel. I use the word serious prima facie, not because I want to load it, but because Judge Ngobo, in the final findings, also when he read it out in that press conference, specifically emphasized that phrase, serious prima facie case to answer. So that's the reality, and it's based on those facts that are not disputed, which we all know, which Arthur Fraser, through his patriotic action, of once it came to his knowledge of saying, I cannot allow this just to be swept away. I must now be a South African patriot and go and report on this, because this is so serious that it cannot be ignored. And also understanding that once he became aware of it and he didn't report on it, he himself would have been criminally liable, because he was aware of a crime and he didn't report it.
Which
so
is one of the
we
serious
all should be
charges.
hugely grateful to Arthur for what he had done. And the consequences, of course, is dire and severe for Ramaphosa, but rightly so. And hopefully, if we can now, after all the shenanigans and all the attempts to cover up and to abuse the majority of the ANC in Parliament, if we can now finally, through the impeachment committee, get to the bottom of it. And I hope that the members of the ANC and other members of the Government of National Unity who are going to sit on that impeachment committee, because the reality of the way the numbers play out in Parliament is that they will be the majority, that they will this time around not allow themselves to be influenced by partisan selfish interests, but that they will put the nation first, and therefore that they will make sure that the impeachment committee does its work, uncover everything, doesn't leave a stone unturned to get to the bottom of what has happened. Even some of these other questions that you asked, where did the money come from? Because it is relevant that we should know where eventually the money came from, because evidently the money didn't come from this strange buyer from somewhere up north in Africa who came to buy buffalo and then just deposited the money as if, you know, this is confetti, and left, never got a buffalo, never took anything out of the country, never managed to get anything for the money that he paid. I mean, that's illogical. It's ridiculous. So certainly that's not the story. So we need to find out, where did the money come from? And then, of course, the rest of the facts that I've already referred to, which are established facts, which indicate criminal activity and breaking of the law by Ramaphosa and those who he instructed, like Wally Rode, to break the law.
Let's say the president did resign.
Mm-hmm.
Would the EFF, which shout out to EFF for holding the parliament accountable and for pushing that.
Thank you.
Would EFF still want to push ahead with the impeachment, or if the president resigned, would it be
Again,
something
it's
well
a
under the bridge?
speculative question.
Okay.
I can't speculate about it. I can only deal with the facts. The fact of the matter is that a resignation by a president, and now I'm talking in terms of the general rules that regulate impeachment. The resignation of the president does not absolve him from impeachment. So whether he resigned or not, he can still be impeached. Whether we would have pursued the matter if he resigned, I cannot speculate on. But the reality is When he had done wrong, he can still face those consequences, and he can also face the very serious consequences if and when he is impeached, which means that all his rights are taken away. He literally becomes as if he had never been a president. And that possibility still stands firmly. It is squarely on the table.
So, EFF, shout out once again for holding Parliament accountable. But what is the role? How does EFF see itself and its role in the political system we have?
We are a party that are committed to the fundamental economic transformation of South Africa. That phrase that we use, economic freedom in our lifetime, is not just a nice slogan. It is the generational task that we have to eventually be able to achieve that objective. That objective means that we must relentlessly work to expose all criminal activity, all corruption, to expose all looting of the resources of the state, on the one hand. On the other hand, to work for a fundamental restructuring of the whole economic system. The issues that I've referred to earlier in this interview, return of the land to the people without compensation, the nationalization of some of the economic heights of our economy, including the banks and the big mining industry and some of the big manufacturing industry. Putting the state at the center of economic transformation. Don't allow the state to be pushed to the periphery, but make it the main instrument and engine of economic transformation. So yes, at the moment, we are not in the majority. At least not in the various assemblies, elective assemblies of South Africa, whether it's national, provincial, or at a municipal level. So we are in opposition. So we must be the best possible opposition that we possibly can be. These ideals that I've just articulated for you, which are also expressed in the 7 cardinal pillars, that are the founding document of the EFF that informs ideologically the positions and the standings that we take. These must inform us how we oppose, how we act as an opposition, a constructive opposition. And we committed ourselves at the beginning of the 7th administration that we are not just going to be disruptive. We want to be constructive. We're going to engage on the basis of these ideological principles that we hold strongly. And we hope through that process of opposition, we will be able to bring around change now already, and we are succeeding. You can see what we do in terms of the very important question of outsourcing and insourcing. In many local municipalities where we have some influence, we succeed in pushing for the issue of insourcing. We are also tabling an insourcing bill in Parliament. We are tabling that very, very important piece of legislation sponsored by Sihle Lonzi about making sure that student debt is written off so that we allow students to be able to get a job without being burdened by this huge study debt that they now tend to carry. We've done all of these things. Already as an opposition, we're influencing the right decisions within government. And in that process, we hope as time goes on and we grow, we gain more power, we become more involved in government, as we've now managed. Also here in the provincial government of Gauteng, where we now have the MEC for Finance, which is from the EFF, the chairperson of the EFF in Gauteng, that we will be able to continue to show what we are capable of doing once we gain power And I believe as time goes on, the EFF will become increasingly influential through its opposition politics, but also in those areas where we do get control of the leverage of power, and we can utilize them to implement the 7 cardinal pillars of the EFF and bring around that economic transformation that we have committed ourselves to.
How would EFF deal with there's this whole narrative of doomsday, the markets won't be happy, the rand will crash if EFF came into power or increased its representation?
It's total propaganda. Rubbish. The EFF, wherever it gets into government, has shown itself to be a cleaner government, free from corruption, compared to what you've seen in the very compromised ANC. The EFF, where we've had members of mayoral councils, where we've been able to control particular areas of governance, we've excelled. You can see what happened in Ekurhuleni, the issues around water provision, which was based on the presence of a member of the mayoral council of the EFF, was excellent compared to many other municipalities and many other metros where it failed. You saw the role that MMCs of the EFF are playing in Tshwane, the way in which the cleanliness of the city and the infrastructure and the road developments of the city have changed under MMCs from the EFF. In the city of Johannesburg, we've got an MMC for social development and health of the EFF, who's introduced clinics that are 24/7 open, who's improved the service of basic primary health care to the population of Johannesburg tremendously. We've had a very, very successful MMC for safety in Johannesburg, in the person of Dr. Twaku. Now it has been changed, and we now have the secretary, provincial secretary of the EFF, that has taken over in that position of MMC for safety in the city of Johannesburg. But if you look at the role that the Johannesburg Metropolitan Police are playing, they are extremely effective. They are very effective in terms of crime management and challenges to crime. They have fought the problem of the occupation, on illegal occupation of buildings in the Johannesburg CBD. They have improved their whole profile and the services that they provide to the community. And that has been done because of the presence of MMCs coming from the EFF. Now we have a new MMC in that particular portfolio for public safety in the Johannesburg Metro, Moshe Koma, who is, as I say, the secretary of the EFF in Gauteng, and we're going to see a further increase in service delivery there. So wherever the EFF do manage to come into power, we deliver. And that record of performance and of delivery is what we hope will influence the public to vote for the economic freedom fighters, because when we get into power, we commit, we carry out what we said we will do, and we actually provide service delivery.
Immigration's been a hot topic. What's EFF's stance on immigration, both legal and illegal immigration?
Well, the EFF has been very clear that we stand for a united state of Africa. We have been very clear that the borders that we have in the African continent are borders that have been imposed on us by the colonists through the Berlin Conference in the late 1880s. And that these borders do not serve the people of the African continent. But simultaneously, we've said that we are not standing for a process of unregistered and undocumented peoples throughout Africa. In fact, we believe that registration and documentation is absolutely critical for the forging of unity. Because we must understand where people come from, what the levels of economic development are in those areas where they come from, what their domiciles are. We must understand the movements within the African continent in order to achieve a united African economy, in order to eventually introduce one currency, one government, and one economic model that will reflect the unevennesses and realities of the African continent and try to even those out and create a more equal society throughout Africa. So that's what we stand for. A united Africa, one that doesn't abide by the false, illogical borders that have been imposed on us by the colonists, but we stand simultaneously for proper registration, control, and management of the population of the African continent throughout the whole of Africa. And we believe that a united economy will give us that much greater power to be able to compete on the international world stage. Just imagine if the African continent can be united with the minerals that we have, with the rare earth minerals that we have, and we have a rational policy of the enrichment and the development of those minerals by Africans for Africans. We will become a powerhouse. And those who don't want to see us becoming that powerhouse wants to perpetuate this concept of nation states within the African continent, trying to use the same model that they've used in Western Europe and other places and conflictual nation states with each other. Instead, we should develop an African personality, what Kwame Nkrumah referred to as an African caring about the whole of the African continent and about the development of this continent as an economic unity that can serve all the people of Africa. It is nonsense to say that Africans who come from other parts of Africa and who end up in South Africa are really the reason why South Africans are unemployed. There are much deeper, fundamental capitalist economic systems at play, which causes the levels of unemployment and super exploitation. And the reality is, because we don't have proper documentation, because we don't have proper registration of the movement of Africans also to South Africa, those big capitalist companies are able to exploit this lack of proper registration in order to employ people coming from other parts of Africa into South Africa at the cheapest of rates, undercutting minimum wages, and undermining, therefore, also the rights, the established rights of South African citizens. That's the reality. Not a reality that Africans who come from other parts of Africa are taking the jobs of Africans who live in the South African region away from them. That is a fallacy. The reality is very, very different. And as my Commander-in-Chief, Julius Malema, said, it is a lie to say that fellow Africans are taking the jobs of South Africans. But the reality is that we should not allow ourselves to be maneuvered into a position where we treat our fellow Africans as illegal immigrants and so-called foreigners on the African continent. You know, the problem is that whites and white monopoly capitalism has stoked on not necessarily even so much xenophobia, but Afrophobia. They do so for their own nefarious purposes. Because, sadly, the many European immigrants or immigrants coming from Asia or wherever that are in South Africa, they are not identified as a risk. They are not identified as being a challenge to our people. They don't get called out for taking the jobs of South Africans, but fellow Africans are being targeted, are being called out for taking jobs. That's a sad situation, and it doesn't reflect the true reality of what we are faced with in South Africa. I know it's a complicated issue. I know that on the ground, people have a first-hand experience in the townships of fellow Africans who they see as a challenge for them and for jobs. But that is manufactured and it is manipulated in order to come over like that. We must avoid it. We must have what we call in the EFF superior logic. We need to implement our understanding of how a capitalist economy works. We need to understand that a united Africa must be an Africa which is going to be built on socialist principles of a strong central state, of strong economic development throughout the continent, of a sharing of the resources, and not of playing each other off against each other at cutthroat competition models on which capitalism thrives.
On the aspect of what the CIC said with regards to jobs of locals not being taken by fellow Africans, what is the reality then?
The reality is what I've just explained to you, that the capitalist model exploits the undocumented movement of people from other parts of Africa in order to undercut jobs, payment, lack of adherence to minimum wages and labor laws in South Africa. And that is the level at which we need to approach this problem. Not on the level of turning my fellow brother and sister in Africa into my perceived enemy.
Okay.
Because once you go for that model of saying this fellow brother and sister, these are the enemies rather than the capitalist state that thrives on the lack of proper documentation, the lack of proper registration of the movements of people throughout Africa, and therefore also thrives on the ability to cut the basic legislation out that should be implemented to avoid poverty wages, to avoid the underpayment of people, then you understand who your enemy is. But if you go on march to march and you simply say, because that person is not originally from this region of South Africa, that fellow African brother and sister is an enemy, it falls right into the trap of how the big capitalist organizations want to continue to divide and play us off against each other. Let me come back to the point I made to you earlier. The biggest fear that the imperialists have is that Africa will unite. That Africa will be able to utilize its massive resources in a rational and properly planned developmental economy that can develop those resources for our benefit. that Africa will no longer be a vassal continent for the rest of the imperialists. The only way they can avoid that is to keep on dividing us, to keep on insisting that there must be these fake national states, which had been imposed on us by the Berlin Conference and by the colonists. Once we can break out of that, the African continent will become an absolute powerhouse. In fact, it can dominate the world economy if we can manage to break out of these divisions that are consistently and artificially being imposed on us by the imperialists. But they will do everything possible to avoid us from getting to that point of unity. That is why someone like Muammar Gaddafi had to be killed, because the message that he brought of unity, and especially the anti-dollar message that he delivered, and the need for one African currency and African development structures, were far too dangerous to allow it to be pursued. And sadly, of course, there are African leaders who continue to allow themselves to be bought out by these big imperialists. We've had a recent example again of what William Ruto did in Kenya, where Macron, under attack, because many of the former African colonies are now beginning to stand up and find their feet and fighting back, Macron go and use a non-French speaking, non-Francophone country such as Kenya to use as the base for a conference which he utilizes simply to try and reassert the influence of France, that old colonial influence of France in Africa. And Ruto allows himself to be bought over by the trinkets that France was handing out, so-called developmental money, to Kenya. Very sad. But it's one of the examples about how some of our African leaders sell out what is necessary for Africa, and that is African unity. And they will continue to be abused and used as dividers as long as they put their own personal self-interest and the buying over of themselves by the imperialists up front rather than the future of Africa.
There's one question I have to ask, and I suspect I know what your answer would be, that it's speculative. However, I have to ask it. Would EFF support Paul Mashatile to be the next president in the event of a GNU?
It's premature. Paul Mashatile evidently has done some good things in the time that he has been in government, also here in Gauteng. And my commander-in-chief and president recently referred to one of those projects which are part of the success stories that we can tell about Gauteng, and that's Gautrain. So obviously, there is a positive disposition to some of the work that Paul Mashatile had done. But I think it would be hugely irresponsible of me to sit here and come and say, I'm not even a member of the central command team of the EFF. I've only joined the EFF less than 3 years ago, so I'm not entitled to be a member of the central command team of the EFF. I cannot talk on behalf of the leadership of the EFF. But I suspect even if you had the top leaders, one of the top leaders of the EFF in this seat where I'm sitting today,
which we hope to get.
I beg your pardon?
Which we hope to get.
I'm sure that's your duty as a podcast to try and get those leaders to come and sit here. But I think even if they were here, and when you do manage to bring them here and you present this question to whoever that leader is, they will tell you it is not the right time and place to be speculative about that issue.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for making time and giving us insights representing EFF, everything they stand for and the work they've done, especially in holding the executive accountable.
Thank you so much. And perhaps I should conclude with a very personal comment. I've gone through 45 years of the ANC, close to 45. It was 44 and I think 9 months. Last years of my life in the ANC was hugely unhappy. And I felt very unhappy about the way in which the ANC had betrayed the liberation struggle. I'm an extremely happy man to sit here today to be part of what I believe is the true liberation movement in South Africa, with the generational mission to bring fundamental economic change. So, in a way, my joining of the economic freedom fighters gave me a second life and a new hope that even at this age, with this grey beard, I can still make a contribution. So it is in that context that I also participated in this interview with you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Guys, you've heard it for yourself. Let us know your comments. Like, subscribe, share. Palatable Politics.